Hello coders, welcome back to another video. In this video we are going to be covering the other portion of loops. The last tutorial was for loops. This tutorial is going to cover while loops and do while loops. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the while loop works very much similar to the for loop. If you may recall, a loop is used to execute a certain block of code for a certain number of times. So with a while loop, the while loop is going to run a specific code until a certain condition is met. And that condition is given to the user through the while loop. So let's go ahead and see an example of a while loop. So the first thing you need to do for a while loop is state while. And then empty parentheses. Follow that by curly braces. Now, where my cursor is on line 7, that is the while loop body. So this is the area of code that will repeat while the condition is true. Right now, we currently do not have any conditions. That's why we're getting the X or the red error. So we're going to go ahead and add a condition. So a condition is something that can be tested, whether it's true or false. So while something is true, we want this to happen, etc., etc. So in this case, what we are going to do is let's go ahead and create an integer value out here. So we'll say int x equals 0. So now we have an integer variable x that holds the number 0. And we're going to use this in our while loop. So we can use x in our condition. So we could say x is less than or equal to 10. Then we want to print something out. So let's go ahead and write our print statement. Print line. And we'll put while loop is running. All right. That's just going to tell us that our loop is running. And then what we could do is we could also do a print statement to tell us what the number is. So system out print line, the number is currently all right. Now that print statement will tell us where our number is in the loop. So now we have two statements in our while loop body, two print statements. So every time our loop runs, these two print statements should run as well. Now remember, our loop is going to run as long as our condition is true. So running this, you see that it's continuously printing out our two print statements. Now in this case, we have created an infinite loop, which is a loop that will continuously run until it is stopped. So we basically did not create anything that would stop our condition from being true. So the loop is going to continue to run until our condition is false. So we're going to have to manually stop this loop. And what we have to do is now figure out how to make our condition here false instead of true. Now the only way we could do that is by increasing the value of x. So if we come in here and we do x plus plus, which will increment our value of x, then it will continuously change the value of x each time the loop runs. So now when we run it again, you see we no longer have an infinite loop, and our output shows you when our loop is running. So it shows you it goes from 0 all the way to 10. And as soon as it hits 10, it stops running. The reason it stopped running when it hit 10 is because when we said while x is less than or equal to 10. So that is why it stopped at 10. So if you were to change that to 20, then you would see the outputs all the way to 20. Same for 50 and so on. So now that we got the basics of the while loop down, we can go ahead and continue to experiment with the while loop. So in this example, we gave it a number in our condition 10. You could also just have multiple variables that are being compared as well. In the case where we could have our user ask for a number. So we could use the scanner. So let me import that. All right. Then we're going to create a scanner down here. So we'll do scanner, scan equals new scanner system.in. So now that we have our scanner, we're going to go ahead and give it a print statement to tell the user what to enter. So system.out.print line. How many times would you like to play the game? Enter a number. So then we could say int plays equals scan dot next int. And that's going to hold the number of plays. So now that we have that, let me get rid of this sum. Now that we have that, we could create a while loop using that variable plays. So we could do while x is less than, let me put my parentheses. While x is less than or equal to plays. So for this, let's go ahead and change this back to I, and we'll create a variable called I. Right. So now, basically, we're going to run the loop for this many times. So we'll go ahead and create a print statement in here, system.out.print line. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this so I can reuse it. All right. And we're going to say, what game do you want to play? Then we'll give them the options. So we'll say 1, guess the color. We'll say 2, guess the number. So 2 simple games, nothing too major, being that this is an example of a while loop. But that would ask them what games they want to play. So in this case, Obviously, we don't have anything that's going to increase our I, so we would need to do that. So at the very end of our loop, we would have to do I plus plus to increase it, to make the loop, make loop condition false. So now if we run this, then you see it asks us how many times do we want to play. We'll put 4. And then as you see here, in our output, we have the outputs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now remember, in Java, your counting starts at 0. So in this case, if you really want the user to see the output 4 times, you would have to take out the equal sign. And then when you rerun it, you should see it 4 times. So if we go ahead and click 4 again, then you see 1, 2, 3, 4. So those are certain cases where you do have to pay attention to when you're using the less than equal to or greater than equal to when you're using a while loop, because sometimes it will matter depending on what you're trying to do. However, you see in our while loop that we pretty much did a simple example of a game. Now, we're not actually implementing the game here. We're just kind of setting it up as if we were. So what you could do now in this case is we could embed an if statement. So if the user enters 1, then we want to run this set of code. If the user enters 2, we want to run this set of code. So I'm not going to do that because that's not the purpose of this tutorial, but just to show you what you can do with the while loop in this case. All right, so those were 2 examples of 2 different ways you can use your while loops. You can also use them in different cases other than the ones that I have shown, obviously, but those are just some simple ones to show how to use a while loop for a certain number of times. So hopefully that was kind of easy to catch on. Generally, once you know for loops, it is easier to get the concept of a while loop because they're very similar, which is why I'm not necessarily going into deep detail about the while loop as I am with the for loop because it's kind of repetitive information. But I did want to show you at least 2 different ways to do the while loop. So now let's go ahead and get into the do while loop. So your do while loop is going to be similar to the while loop, except with the do while loop, the body of the do while loop will execute before the expression or condition is checked. So you may be confused, like, what does that mean? I'm not sure, I'm not getting it. That's okay. As we work through the example, I'll make sure you understand. So first, let's go ahead and create a do while loop. So you would first say do, followed by curly braces. And then inside here is the body of the loop that I was referring to. And then you need to finish it with a while. And then give it a condition. Right? So we already have some variables established. So we'll create another one as well. So we'll say int y equals 5. So now we have our variable created. We're going to use that in our condition, and we'll just say while y is less than 10, we want to do some sort of code. So here we'll put body of do while so we know when it prints out what's going on. And then we could say y is going to be equal to or add to y 2. So this is going to add 2 to y. So this is what's going to change our value of y to eventually make our loop end. So here we could have a print statement that first tells us the number that y starts off at. So here we could put y is currently then put y. After this we can do y is now. So that way we can see the changes of y. Now we'll go ahead and run that. And it's going to ask us how many times do we want to play the game. We'll say 1. All right. Now, if you look down here, we have our output from our do while. So from our example, let me scroll that up. We started off y at 5. So when I mentioned that the first thing that happens with your do while loop is that it actually is going to execute the body of your while loop first. So that's what it did. So it's executing the body of this do while loop right here. So everything that's in here is what happens as soon as you execute the do while loop. So if you look here, it says body of do while. Y is currently 5 and y is now 7, which is true because we started off at 5. It then checked our condition, which is here. Being that y is 7 and that's still less than 10, it ran again. So it printed out that body one more time and then it checked the solution again and it stopped at 9. Being that 9 was still less than 10, it ran the do while body again. And then you see it printed out that it was 9 and then y was 11. So once y hit 11, the do while loop broke because 11 is greater than 10, and then that stopped our do while loop. So overall, that is the tutorial of while loops and do while loops. Basically, they're a lot similar to work with than the for loop. They just take in one condition, whereas the for loop, you had to initialize the variable, you had to create the condition, and then have the increment. Here, you just had to have your condition. And all you have to worry about is making sure that your condition that is in your while or your do while loop eventually turns false to avoid infinite loops. So these are a lot simpler to work with than your for loops. Generally, people will use this if they don't necessarily know how many times they want to run the loop. So if you know how many times you want to run the loop, you could simply just use a for loop. But if you don't necessarily know, you can use the while loop and just figure out a way to make the condition eventually turn false within the loop somehow, similar to what we're doing in our examples here. But as you see, it's a lot easier to use than the for loop. And hopefully it wasn't too confusing to you. Generally, most people just use the while loop. But if you like how the do while works, then please, by all means, use it in your code. But I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of the 3 different loops. So we covered for loops last time. This time we covered while loops and do while loops. And hopefully this was helpful for you. So coders, as I always like to say, keep practicing. The more you practice, the better you get. The better you get, the more confident you'll feel in programming. So thank you for your time watching this video, and I can't wait to see you in the next tutorial.